Speaking of the protest, Glenn Greenwald actually debated Ilya Shapiro about the campus protests. Now, again, you guys know, I think most of you know, Glenn Greenwald is really serious about free speech. He is definitely pro free speech. He's spoken out about it multiple times. I told you he was just at an event recently speaking on this issue. So I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves, if we say we're pro free speech, are we saying that because it's in reference to an issue that we support? Or are we saying that just overall across the board? Because what Glenn Greenwald has pointed out a couple times on his show System Update is that some of the people that have said they were pro free speech, is particularly during the January 6th protests, and particularly like the Daily Wire, he said he's noticing that once the issue changed to an issue that they disagree with, all of a sudden they're not pro free speech on that issue. So let's get into this debate with Glenn Greenwald and Shapiro. This is going to be very interesting. It gets a little heated. Let's go ahead and dive right in.
If you expel and arrest the students who tore down that fence there, flesh out that point for us.
Sure. I'm basically with Ben Sasse, the president of the University of Florida, Diermeyer, the president of Vanderbilt, who've been putting out op-eds and stating that they are broadly protective of speech, as am I, fully agree with that. But when you analyze the situation, you have to understand that not everything is speech. That is, if you're taking actions that break the rules, break the law, whether it's vandalism, assault, or anything else, you don't get a pass if you're doing it for an expressive purpose, whether that's political, artistic, or otherwise. Then there's some speech that's simply not protected, death threats or incitement of violence. Pretty high bar, according to Supreme Court jurisprudence. And then there are time, place, and manner regulations. And this is central to this debate. So in the campus context, you can't block access to educational facilities. You can't disrupt classes or organized student meetings that have been duly reserved and things like that. You can't harass.
Pause. So I'm sorry, but this has been done on college campuses throughout history. This hall that was, they said the hall was occupied. They renamed it Hens Hall. That hall has been occupied before during the apartheid protests against South Africa. We have to remember the Vietnam War protests were largely on college campuses in this country. This is not the first time this has happened. I think it's important to know the historical context. It's not like these students just woke up one day and said, ha, I have an idea. Let's occupy this hall and let's just pick this random hall. No, that hall has history when it comes to protest movements in this country.
And intimidate. There are rules about these sorts of things. In the off-campus context, the equivalent is, even though we care about political speech, I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That's disturbing the peace. So here, there are clear rules. You get to speak and protest as long as you're not disrupting the event, disrupting classes, otherwise preventing the university from achieving its educational mission. And so these are clear lawbreakers, rule breakers, and actions have consequences.
Protests are about disruption. I mean, he wants you to go protest in a quiet corner somewhere where no one else is going to be around and no one else is going to see it. Protests are about disruption. The civil rights movement, where they marched through the streets, that was about disrupting the streets, the flow of traffic. The sit-ins that happened in diners in the South, that was about disrupting the flow of money and capital at those establishments. That is the whole point of having a protest. He really does want you to go protest in a tent somewhere, like out in the middle of nowhere where no one's going to see it and no one's going to hear it.
Glenn, I don't think anybody believes that there should be no laws. But what's your response to the claim that these particular protesters ought to be expelled or arrested, or in general that the protesters need to be thoroughly cracked down on because they broke some laws?
I think the only way to determine the authenticity of somebody's beliefs about free speech, defense of free speech, their interpretation of free speech, the only way is whether they apply standards consistently to the views that they most hate and the views that they most like. Now, Ilya is a fanatical supporter of Israel, and the protesters the crackdown on whom he's defending are expressing a view and defending a cause that he vehemently dislikes. What I think is so important to point out is there's a historical context here. It's not as though the crackdown on student groups began only with these encampments. Immediately after October 7th, we began seeing all sorts of attempts to stifle political speech, the most extreme of which was when Ron DeSantis ordered pro-Palestinian groups to be shut down on all University of Florida campuses, a move that the only real nonpartisan free speech organization in the country, Fire.org, said was not only a grave assault on the First Amendment free speech rights of pro-Palestinian students, but was such an obvious and glaring violation of the First Amendment that they wrote a letter to university administrators urging them to ignore the order by Governor DeSantis. There have been a lot of those kinds of attacks well before these encampments arose. And of course, before October 7th, one of the most common forms of censorship on political campuses and elsewhere were attempts to silence Jewish students. There have been pro-Palestinian students, rather. There have been professors who have been fired for criticizing Israel. There have been student groups whose application to exist have been denied because they're pro-Palestinian. Fire.org has been defending these people for a long time. So a lot of conservatives wave the free speech banner when it comes to targeting conservative speech. And I do too. I defend that speech. And yet suddenly abandon those standards as soon as it comes to the cause that they most love or the speech they most hate, which is criticism of Israel. The other thing I want to point out is,
before he points out the next thing, I just want to mention something really quick, because that is a really good point that Glenn is bringing up. Again, it's like, are you pro-free speech or not? Or are you just pro-free speech about your particular issue? And I'll give you another example. I didn't see this type of criticism as someone who has lived in the South. Where was this same criticism and rhetoric from a lot of the people that are pro-Israel when every year we have seen white supremacists have marches through the South? Where was this same criticism, right? The same way that they are saying the pro-Palestinian protesters are displaying hate speech, which I disagree. I have not heard that at all. That's not what I've seen. A lot of the hate speech and the hateful language is coming from the pro-Israel counter protesters, from what I have seen. But the way that they can actually use that type of rhetoric towards the pro-Palestinian protesters who were camping out on the college lawns peacefully, I didn't hear those same people use that same type of rhetoric all these years when white supremacist groups and white nationalists marched through the South. Listen, I went to the University of South Carolina. They march through there at least once a year. I haven't lived there in a while, so I have to double check. But when I lived there, they would march through there at least once a year through downtown Columbia, right over to Gervais Street in front of the State House. Now, you have to know at that point in time, the State House had the Confederate flag. This was a big controversial issue during that point in time. They said, why does South Carolina have the Confederate flag flying over at the State House along with the American flag? Now, the defense that they had at that point in time is that it was memorial. I'm like, yeah, whatever, right? But it was obvious, like, that flag flying over at the State House, that actually hurt Columbia economically. Did you know that there were businesses that refused to actually open a location in Columbia, South Carolina because of that flag? Did you know that the University of South Carolina football team, they actually missed out on top recruits because parents didn't feel comfortable sending their kids to a school that was in a city, because the University of South Carolina is right in downtown Columbia. They didn't feel comfortable sending their kids to that school because that flag was right there downtown near the campus. Do you know that? So where were all these people then? Right? You didn't hear from them. Where was Bill Ackman? Where were all those people?
Of course, it's the case that if you engage in violence, you should be arrested. The problem is a lot of the violence, I would even say most, recently has come from pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel counter-protesters. They showed up at a camp at the UCLA and began violently hurling objects and using tear gas and injured a bunch of pro-Palestinian protesters at the camp. There's a study that was just released by a group that follows public crises and safety crises that said that 99% of the protests that have been taking place on campus have been peaceful, and the 1% that was things like the UCLA one. And, there are a lot of protests that use civil disobedience. One of the protest movements that conservatives most revere and most champion and heralded and defended was the truckers' protest in Canada, which was designed to protest the Trudeau government's mandates for COVID vaccines as a way to keep your job. And yet they used civil disobedience. They blocked streets. They prevented cars from passing all the time in Toronto. And yet the crackdown on those protests was deemed tyrannical by conservatives because in that case, they agreed with the cause. So I think the context here is important. Of course, if protesters attack Jewish students, which has not been happening, using violence, and even if the ones who are blocking ingress and egress, which I am not comfortable with, to say, okay, you cannot do that, I'm fine with that as well. But there has been a overall very potent movement to suppress and censor criticism of Israel or pro-Palestinian speech for a long time. And a great part of what's happening now is a byproduct of that vision.
So, Ilya, you've been an outspoken critic of a lot of the crackdowns on speech on campuses towards the right in recent years that Glenn was alluding to there. Why are you not a hypocrite in this case? Basically, how do you respond to the allegation that you're a hypocrite for wanting a crackdown in these cases with the pro-Palestine student protesters?
And this is really important because she's referring to, this is Shapiro here up at the top. This is really important because she's correct. When it comes to this particular issue, he's speaking out against the protest, but he supported these protests in reference to conservative issues. So people have to understand that.
Well, Glenn and I are in full agreement that FIRE is one of the greatest organizations in America. I'm a big fan, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I spoke at their big national gala last year. I agree with them 99% of the time. I don't think I agree with myself 100% of the time, but FIRE does fantastic work. And I defend speech and expression, but the rubber hits the road of what happens when you're indeed violating the rules. And Glenn is getting at that when he starts talking about civil disobedience. If indeed the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protesters are engaged in civil disobedience, then what is that? That's the willingness to suffer consequences, to go to jail, to be expelled or disciplined, to highlight, to showcase the injustice or illegitimacy of the law or policy that they're protesting. Think about Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, the prototypical examples of civil disobedience.
Pause. See, this is where I do the gotcha moment. Because you see, people like Shapiro here, they love to use the example of MLK and civil disobedience and protesting. And I want to remind you that when you talk about occupying a hall, how is that any different from sit-ins that were done during the civil rights protests? You see, they love to use MLK as an example, but they don't get into the details about all the things that were done during the civil rights movement. Sit-ins is still occupying a space, right? When you go into that diner and you sit down on that seat and you don't order any food, that is still occupying that space, correct? That is the same thing here. So people like Shapiro and others, they love to invoke MLK when they think it fits and supports their narrative. And a lot of times they get it wrong. And as peaceful as the protests were during the civil rights movement under MLK, you have to remember the way that the police state responded to those protesters, the way that the police sick dogs on these people. They use fire hoses on these people. You ever stand in front of a fire hose? You know how powerful that water pressure can be? They beat the protesters. They jailed them. And every time MLK came back around and said, we need to continue to be peaceful. We can't fight back because then we'll look a certain way. Well, you know what? I wonder if I speak to some of those protesters in the civil rights movement that are still alive today, I wonder if they feel like that was necessarily the right thing to do. Because time after time, they went out on the streets and they got their ass beat. They got their heads bashed in. They had dogs sicked on them, and they were being peaceful, Shapiro. So what Shapiro is telling you is that he still wants the police state to be able to attack you anyway, whether you are peaceful or not. People need to learn the definition of sit-ins. People need to learn what it means to occupy something. And stop using MLK's name to help fit your narrative when you can't even get it right. And by the way, MLK, towards the end, he actually questioned whether or not peaceful protest was the right thing to do.
It's not yelling and intimidating and harassing and vandalizing, all of these sorts of aggressive actions that I think are counterproductive even for their causes. And this has nothing to do with whether you're a pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Yeah, UCLA, I don't know what exactly went down, but to the extent that the pro-Israel side was engaged in violence, that's not good, and that's not protected speech either.
So here's where he reveals himself again. He tells you he doesn't even know what happened at the UCLA protest. He tells you he doesn't even know what went down, but here he is speaking his piece on it. So you guys see this? He goes on to tell you he doesn't think that you should yell during protests. Yelling is a problem. Like I said, this guy wants you to basically sit in a corner, a quiet corner somewhere where no one can see you, and wants you to protest that way. I don't think he was prepared for this debate.
So, I try to be principled as much as the next guy, and we can debate the DeSantis order about Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a separate issue about organizational structure and material support for terrorism, which the Supreme Court has held is not protected by the First Amendment. But in terms of individual speech versus violating the rules, I try to be very consistent. And, those on the left who on October 6th would have wanted to discipline those who use the wrong pronouns or otherwise engage in microaggressions, if they're hypocritical, there's no crime against that. The Americans have the right to do so. But again, we have to be clear about what we're dealing with these protests, these encampments. If you're violating neutral rules, that's a different situation than engaging in free speech. And again, those university officials, whatever their underlying personal politics or viewpoints that have done well in these situations, have made clear that these are the rules. We protect free speech, and we enforce our rules against disruption or violence or blocking access or otherwise preventing the educational institution from going about its duties.
Let's fast forward to this piece here when they get to the discussion about what separates free speech from violent speech. And I also want to bring up this particular part as well. Let me pause here and unpause. I want to bring up this part as well. Let me actually move this out. He is telling you that if those attacks actually did happen, in reference to the pro-Israel protesters, he's saying, well, then that's not right either. But the point is, he wasn't focusing on that. He didn't want to focus on it, and that's intentional. His goal is to make it seem like the violent people are the pro-Palestinian protesters. So when he says he doesn't know what actually went down at UCLA, that is intentional. He didn't want to know what went down at UCLA. Now let's go into this part here when we talk about free speech versus violent speech.
And actually, because there's something interesting, and Glenn, you mentioned this earlier, and I don't want to gloss over it, that when there are violations, it's reasonable in certain cases, and that's where I want to kind of drill down into specifics, for the university to respond by enforcing its rules. So while we're talking about our alma maters, my alma mater, George Washington University, there was a leader, I actually don't know if they were a student or not, chanting guillotine. There were some students in the audience chanting guillotine in reference to different university officials that were being put on a sort of mock trial in the middle of the encampment there. Obviously at Columbia, we saw some obvious vandalism, breaking into the building, et cetera. So Glenn, what is your where's the line for you as to what's protected speech, what's protected civil disobedience, or not protected civil disobedience, but what's sort of tolerable civil disobedience? How do you kind of categorize different things we've seen at these encampments?
Yeah, I think it absolutely depends on the impact. Obviously, if you have people using violence, and there have been so many hate crimes hoaxes about trying to create this narrative that American Jews are this new endangered and victimized group. They can't even walk outside without being violently attacked. The one example that spread all over the media and that was promoted by Barry Weiss's Free Press ended up being a complete hoax. This Jewish student who has been a longtime pro-Israel activist who claimed that she was stabbed in the eye with a...
Remember that story? Remember the student that said that she was stabbed in the eye? So again, that was Barry Weiss outlet that reported that story. Barry Weiss, also a Zionist. I told you how she's been in reference to this particular issue, right? But I remember when I called out Barry Weiss and Coleman Hughes, and Coleman Hughes also writes for that outlet as well. When I called him out, all of a sudden it was just like, oh no, some people were like, no, Sabby, like, why are you bringing up Barry Weiss, and why are you bringing up Coleman Hughes? Because I saw what they were doing. I don't give a damn who Barry Weiss worked for. I don't care how long she was at the New York Times. To me, that actually is not a plus for you, Barry. That actually pushes people to distrust you even more because you were working at the New York Times. Look at all the propaganda that they have released, particularly since October 7th.
Palestinian flag. And then when you watch the video, she was standing near the protesters. They were just marching by her, waving flags. One of the flags just brushed up against her. She went on TV. There was nothing wrong with her eye. She said the only symptom she had was a little bit of a headache. And yet Mike Johnson goes to the Holocaust Museum yesterday and claims that Jewish students, plural, are now having attacks on them violently by being stabbed in the eye with Palestinian flags. It's like a Jussie Smollett level hate crimes hoax, but writ large to justify these aggressive crackdowns. We just had, 2 weeks ago, the House of Representatives that passed a law that wildly expanded the definition of anti-Semitism for anti-discrimination law, and it includes a wide range of views that obviously are constitutionally protected, such as saying that you think Israeli crimes and war are similar to what the Nazis did, to suggest that certain people, evangelicals or American Jews who are inculcated from birth with worshiping Israel and being devoted to it, have a greater allegiance to Israel if it's in conflict with the United States, to even criticizing Israel in a way that is supposedly a double standard, meaning you criticize Israel more harshly than you do. These are now rendered illegal under anti-discrimination law. It's such a full frontal assault on basic free speech rights, in addition to all the other examples that I cited. And I think the most important thing here when we're talking about standards is, I think human beings need to be humble. We are not consistency machines. Of course, we're going to be more inclined to support crackdowns on and censorship of the views that we most hate. And again, Ilya, who is a free speech champion in a lot of contexts, is somebody who is a fanatical devotee to Israel. He really believes that Israel has to be protected and defended. And I think he should be more humble about asking himself whether or not he's applying standards inconsistently, because the people whose silencing he's supporting happen to be people whose views he most hates. I don't think there's another cause that offends him more than this one, namely criticizing Israel or calling for the end of Zionism. And just to point out one example that I
pause there just for a second, and I want to add something because I don't want to lose my train of thought really quick, because Glenn does say a lot in this particular moment. But one of the things in reference to that piece of legislation that Glenn Greenwald was referring to, it's very vague. And it's dangerous to have vague legislation, particularly when you're trying to identify something, as a hate crime or hate speech or something like that. But that is intentional. That is on purpose. They're doing that because basically they don't want anyone to criticize Israel, period. That's why they made it as vague as they did. That is going to be very dangerous. There was one piece of that legislation that I pointed out to you that I was very concerned about as well, because I said, I wonder how Christians are going to feel about this, about how you cannot refer to I guess like, Christ is king, like this kind of thing, in reference to a biblical context, what you can and cannot say, that is very alarming, considering any of you that grew up in the church and you learned under the New Testament. Does that mean that the New Testament is no longer going to be allowed in the United States of America? So those of you, if you're watching and you're a Christian, you need to ask this question. This is why it's dangerous to have legislation that is that vague, but it is intentional.
I referenced earlier a study, not social media anecdotes, but a study that said 99% of campus encampments and protests have been entirely nonviolent. One of the examples of violence behind the UCLA one was a video that surfaced yesterday where a former IDF soldier and a professor at the University of Arizona physically menaced Muslim women by using a posture of wanting to fight, getting an inch away from them, having that body posture like you're ready to hit them. The Muslim women were covering their faces. It was very difficult to watch. That was one of the gravest acts of actual physical intimidation and force that I've seen in any of these incidents. Ilya went onto Twitter and said the following, quote, "A postdoctoral researcher at Arizona State lost his temper after being provoked at a pro-Israel rally over the weekend." So blaming these Muslim women who were physically threatened and menaced, he said it wasn't a good look, but hardly a capital offense.
Yeah, Shapiro wasn't ready for this debate. He is referring to, for those who are not aware, he's referring to the video that I played the other day of the ASU, postdoc researcher who actually was intimidating, came up to the Muslim student and was threatening towards them. So a faculty member, he was actually just removed from ASU. I think I covered that yesterday. Not yesterday. It's today, Sunday, Friday. I believe I covered that Friday. He was actually just removed from ASU. But he is telling you what Shapiro tweeted out. And notice how he said, oh, he lost his temper. So listen to the way that Shapiro has described the pro-Israel protester violence when he's comparing it to the pro-Palestinian protester violence, right? Notice how he is framing the pro-Israel side in such a way that, oh, the guy just lost his temper. No, that was very hateful things that he said towards a student, very hateful things. So it's very clear who he's trying to cover for. He's trying to protect the state of Israel. Ben, I keep saying Ben because his last name is Shapiro. It's Ilya Shapiro. Ilya was not prepared for this debate with Glenn Greenwald. Glenn actually, of course, as usual, did his research, pulled up some of his tweets. So it's not really a good look for Ilya.
Some similarities to my poorly phrased tweet, and then it went on to defend the idea that this professor Jonathan Udelman, who was really the one who used physical menacing, should not even lose his job. Now, if the situation were reversed and these were Muslim men physically menacing Jewish women in this way, I strongly believe that Ilya and many other people would be calling that a terrorist act and demanding their imprisonment and deportation. And so I think it is, I don't think it's a matter of corruption. I just think there are a lot of people who are indoctrinated from birth and bombarded with propaganda. I know this because I was one of them. I grew up in American Jewish culture, who are taught to defend and have loyalty to an affection for Israel above almost any other cause. And the idea that someone's going to be so certain that the reason they generally support free speech, and yet in this case aren't bothered by that congressional law, aren't bothered by DeSantis' shutting down of pro-Palestinian groups on the really noxious theory that now material support of terrorism doesn't mean raising funds for terrorist groups or arming them, but it just means speech that supposedly advances their anti-Israel cause, a grave violation of the First Amendment. The reason why there's this obvious shifting of standards, even of sentiments, is because the people on the right largely revere Israel and have as one of their central causes defending Israel from criticism. And that's why they're so offended by this protest movement.
So that was a lot there. And I don't know how you follow up with that, but that was a lot said there. And it's very telling what's happening here. And when you are taught that no matter what, you have to defend Israel at all costs, like this is part of the reason why Israel doesn't have any accountability. This is part of the reason why there's AIPAC and all that as well. But It's just when you have this belief that like, no matter what, we are in the right. That is a very dangerous type of ideology to have. You know, it kind of gives you a free pass to do whatever you want to do. And no, that should not happen in the world ever. You can watch the full debate of this on Counterpoints. I'm ending there because I know Glenn's expression is like, whoa, like he just get all in. All in. But you can watch the full debate on Counterpoints. It's over an hour. And I say this because as much as I continue to tell you guys, don't give up on the students. You know, they are doing the damn thing. I saw something that really made me smile over the weekend in reference to protests. Is this one okay for you, Ilya? Is this one okay? In case you missed this today, Virginia Commonwealth University graduates staged a walkout during the commencement address by Governor Youngkin in support of Palestine. Let's give it up for the kids.
Deans of the colleges, faculty, staff, family and friends, Grand Nation, graduates. What a distinct privilege it is to join you this morning to honor and congratulate the class of 2024. Deans of the colleges, faculty, staff, family and friends, Grand Nation, graduates. What a distinct privilege it is to join you this morning to honor and congratulate.
At first, when I started to watch this video, it looks like it's going to be about like maybe 10 students walking out. But as you can see, they get up row by row to walk out and do the damn thing.
The class of 2024.
So, yeah, that was in protest of Governor Youngkin. You're wondering why would they do that to him? He is one of the politicians that actually called police on the student protesters. So, yeah, don't worry about the youth guys. They got it. They got this. They know what they're doing. But I'm pretty sure that Ilya, who just had that debate with Glenn Shapiro, would probably have issues with the way that they chose to protest. They want you to sit in a dark corner where no one else is around and no one can hear what you're saying. Dana says, I'm so proud of these young women and men. That's right, Dana, doing the damn thing. I'm proud of them too. I love you guys. You're out there like, yeah, man. All right.